Folks, you may be seated in the ongoing battle that we have Friday nights and Saturday mornings in terms of the temperature in the room. It's either feast or famine, what can I tell you? So it's too hot at the beginning, 5 minutes it'll be too cold, and Maimonides had a concept of Shvil HaZahav, he called it. It's like the golden mean, the exactly perfect place, but we cannot achieve that in our air conditioning system. So I apologize for that. Walk in and prepared to be warm, but bring a jacket with you, I guess. I'd like you for a moment or two to imagine with me it's the most powerful nation in the world, most advanced nation scientifically, most advanced nation mathematically, most prosperous, strongest military in the world, culture capable of enormous, vast building projects, skyscrapers reaching all the way up to the heavens, and country run by a vast bureaucratic system, but at the top of that system is an autocrat, someone who is virtually unlimited in terms of authority or power. The leader has ministers, and the ministers, whether from self-interest or fear or expectation of some kind of reward or a combination of all of these factors, treat the leader with deference, regardless of how odd his requests or commands might be. And the leader uses xenophobia, which I learned all the way back when I was a young rabbinical student. Xenophobia, fear of the other, to rile up the population, makes paranoid claims about the dangers that non-citizens present to the nation. Foreigners in the country are singled out and rounded up and treated with a level of inhumanity and a complete disregard for their basic fundamental human rights. Advisors are appointed by the leader not because of their wisdom or ability, but rather because of their unwavering loyalty to the monarch. In this kind of environment, paranoia thrives. It becomes more and more difficult to understand what's actually going on, what's true, what's real, what's fabricated, what's not fabricated. It becomes more and more challenging in that kind of culture to maintain a moral compass, a sense of what's right and what's wrong. And anger and bitterness and cruelty begin to replace kindness and hope and decency and mercy. And values of human dignity and human freedom are replaced by judgment of the others and a willingness to degrade those with whom you disagree. The ruler of this vast and powerful land sits on his throne, and he is immersed in this sort of miasma of misinformation and paranoia and a deep yearning for revenge. It's a profound need to punish perceived enemies and to strike out against them. Now this was Egypt, just about the time of our Torah portion, Parshat Bo, some 3,500 years ago. Egypt at the time, by far the most powerful nation in the world, the most prosperous. Its military was the strongest in the ancient Near East, for all intents and purposes, the entire known world at the time. Egypt was scientifically advanced. Ancient Egyptians were pioneers in mathematics. They were astronomers. They were able to determine hours of darkness and track the celestial bodies in the sky and calculate the cycle of the year. They created a calendar. They invented hieroglyphics, the Egyptians, one of the earliest known writing systems, which allowed them to keep records, important if a culture wants to grow and have memory, and also to communicate over great distances, and using writing to manage that huge bureaucracy that they had. Their cities were the wonders of the ancient world, the Egyptian cities. Their pyramids, enormous. Some of you have probably seen them, scale and scope in the ancient world, almost unimaginably large. And they were, to the Egyptians, what the great churches of medieval Europe were at one time, or what our skyscrapers are to us today, symbols of the power and might and skill of their culture, and the idea that it would contain that moving forward into the future. Their leader, the Pharaoh, they made into a god. Pharaoh was worshipped in ancient Egypt. Ben and I were talking about this before. He was seen as semi-divine, the Pharaoh, part of God's plan, not God's plan, but God's, small G-O-D-S apostrophe, their God's plan, and even sometimes understood as one of the gods himself. The Torah's Pharaoh, we read about him this morning, read about him last week, read about him a little bit next week as well. Cruel, short-sighted, paranoid, filled with anger, filled with bitterness. Some scholars suggest that the period of the Exodus, that Pharaoh was Ramses II. We know he was seen, Ramses II, as the sun god. The Ra of Ramses is Ra, the sun god of ancient Egypt. And we know also from archaeological evidence that we actually have that during his reign, all of Egypt engaged in a series of monumental building projects. Some of those are the huge statues, some of those were rather huge statues of the Pharaoh himself. It was this Pharaoh that was sitting on his throne and seeing enemies and everyone around him. It was this Pharaoh who grew concerned about a small nomadic people who lived in Goshen. Goshen was sort of the northeastern border of Egypt at that time. That people, they were landless, they were powerless, they were shepherds. They had come to Egypt, at least from what we understand in the Torah, to escape a famine in their native land. And it is this small, landless, powerless group of people that Pharaoh becomes worried about at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Havanit chakma lo, Pharaoh says, let us deal, speaking to his ministers, let us deal cunningly with them, lest they grow great and powerful. The ancient Hebrews easily, because they were powerless, were conscripted into forced labor. They were subjugated, they were denigrated, and of course we know they lived as slaves as well. Now here's where the story takes a strange turn, an unexpected turn, and I would argue here's where the true miracle of the Exodus occurs, right here. And that miracle, the true miracle of the Exodus, it was not the plagues, the last three of which we read about in this morning's Sedra. That miracle was not the parting of the sea that we're going to read about next week in Parshat Beshalach. That miracle, the real miracle, was deeper and more profound, and I would actually say more real than those other miracles. It's a miracle of insight, and it is one of those miraculous insights, those rare, precious few moments in human history when an idea changes the world. An idea that changes the world. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in a wonderful essay at the conclusion of his version of the Haggadah, which I highly recommend. You got plenty of time before Pesach, so you can go out and you can get it. And he points out that ancient Egypt and ancient Israel were actually trying to answer the same question, which is this: how can something be created that will connect a people to eternity? How can something be created that will connect a people, a nation, to what is eternal? That was what Moses and Pharaoh were actually really arguing about. And Pharaoh's answer is one that has long appealed to emperors and kings, throughout history, and that was what we're going to do. We're going to build great monuments and huge structures, and those will stand the test of time. And physical symbols will represent the power and might that we have. But Moses and ancient Israel had a different answer to that question. And despite the fact that they were slaves, and despite the fact that they lived under an oppressive ruler, and despite the fact that they had lived for hundreds of years, 430, the Torah tells us at this point, in the midst of a bankrupt culture and a nation that had lost its way, despite all of that, and maybe actually because of it, they realized that there was a different and better way to build a life, to make a future, and to be connected to that which is eternal. They had been forced to build pyramids with their hands, right? It's physical labor. They had been forced to build pyramids with their hands, but at the very same time, they were building something else in their minds. a faith tradition that was based on compassion and justice and human dignity and the value of freedom, and on the idea that all human beings are equally worthy of dignity, and that no person is any better than any other person. And they built a culture that understood that God is not served by worshiping mighty rulers, but instead, God is served by protecting the dignity and the rights of the widow and the orphan and the weak and the vulnerable, and yes, the ger, the stranger, in your midst. Why? Because the Torah tells us over and over again, Ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers also in the land of Egypt. You know what it feels like. So the true miracle of Israel in ancient Egypt wasn't the darkness, wasn't the slaying of the firstborn, wasn't the splitting of the sea. Instead, it was the creation of a system of values that changed the whole world and that changed all of human history. The Israelites carried those, they didn't have much when they left Egypt. We read about that this morning too. But they had that system of values. And we have held them ever since then. And that to me is the continuing miracle of the Exodus. As the years have passed, we have not somehow forgotten those fundamental values. Tyrants come and go. We have seen as Jews more than our fair share, that is for sure. But there are eternal truths that Moses and Israel discovered some 3,500 years ago in ancient Egypt. And we carry them today, and they guide our lives and enable us as Jews, even in the darkest times, the most difficult times, the most challenging times, to continue to bring light into the world. Shabbat Shalom.